I'm Karen Tweet, and I'm the issue chair for early care and education. Catherine All is our esteemed issue chair for education. And I think we established she's been doing that for 27 years, which kudos, Catherine, for tenacity. And Janet is our child welfare, children's range of children's issues issue chair, and she and I have been I've been back on the lobby team, and Janet, you're relatively new, right? Mm-hmm. But we're glad you're here, and I think we're going to start out with Janet talking about child welfare, and then Catherine will talk about education, and then I will do early care and education. And we'll leave a little bit of time, assuming the presentations are less than 20 minutes, for questions at the end of each person. And then we'll have time at the end for cross-cutting questions. So welcome. And Janet, why don't you get us started?
Well, I want to start, first of all, by kind of providing some context for these issues, or maybe a lens with which to look through them. And that is that children are in a particular place in our society. They can't vote. They operate under a different set of laws, and they don't have the same rights as adults. So in making laws, their voices aren't represented, except as through, we always think that parents represent children and advocate for their best well-being and health, etc. And that works either good or bad, depending on how that goes. But when the state steps in and the child comes into state care, then we have assumed that responsibility of speaking for their well-being and their welfare, not just taking care of it, but also speaking for it. And I think that sometimes we forget that, and that often the laws are really geared toward the system or the people running the system, as opposed to really thinking about the children and their experience. So just a little thought about that. Then in some ways, children that go into the foster care system are rather like refugees. They've lost their family, because oftentimes even siblings aren't put into the same home. They've lost their home. They've lost their school many times. That also means friends, because they're in a different part of the city. Their neighborhood, the places that they know, things become unfamiliar. So they wake up in the morning in a strange home. What's for breakfast? What's the rules? Do you have to clean your plate? Can you not clean your plate? All kinds of things. Where do I go to school? Oh, now I'm in a new classroom. There are all those pieces involved, and they're often bounced from home to home with no say whatsoever in the system and what they want to do with that. And then this leads to a higher prevalence in the number of foster care kids who are in youth prisons. Nearly half of the kids who are in youth prisons have been through the CPS or foster care system. That about 60% of the cases in the sex trade, the child sex trade, are kids who have been in foster care or currently in foster care. And that the school failure rate, kids who do not graduate, is only about half of those children in foster care graduate. And that percentage is actually worse than children who are homeless. So there would be much to say that we have failed in our duty of taking care of those children, and that when we think about the laws that we propose, perhaps we need to think more about their experience and as much as possible include their voices in that. So with that kind of context, I want to look at two different kind of strands of what we'll be looking at this year. There aren't a lot of big changes or big things going on. The strand with actual foster care, last year, if any of you were following, there was a bill 1405 that was preserving public benefits payments. And what that was about is at present, if a child is receiving some kind of benefits, say they lost a parent in the service and they're getting some kind of veterans benefits or SSI benefits or whatever, if they go into foster care, the state absorbs those payments. So they are taken from the children. The bill itself was to preserve those payments, to set them in a fund that would then be available for the children when they aged out of care. And there was a strategy for developing financial literacy written into the bill. It went through the committees just fine, and it wasn't a problem. And I figured it was on its way to being passed. And I was shocked when it got to the House floor, and there were several different legislators who stood up and spoke quite heatedly about why those children did not deserve those benefits, that they were drug addicts or had mental health issues, or they just didn't know how to take care of money and they would misspend it, and thus they shouldn't have it. And it was kind of surprising to me, and it didn't pass. The legislature did set aside some money to study the problem, and Representative Alvarado, who had introduced the bill, is not going to reintroduce it this year. She's going to let the study play out and hopefully come back with an amended piece or with some backing that she hopes to get it passed in 2025. So that's kind of a little teaser for next year. The other one that has been presented actually for several years, and I'm sure will be presented again, is extended foster care services. Right now, under certain circumstances, foster care can be extended from 18 to 21. If a child's in some kind of schooling or trade thing, if they're working certain hours but don't have enough to actually live on, various other kinds of things, and they're still willing to have case management services. Mockingbird Society, which actually does a very good job of trying to incorporate the youth voice in their coming up with legislation, is seeking this bill to extend that from 21 to 25. Because as we know, that 21 doesn't necessarily become a magic number in terms of youth being able to establish themselves, especially if they haven't had a good background, if they've come through the foster care system. So that will be on the agenda, and really hope that this may be the year that we can get that passed. The other strand has to do with sexual abuse of children. Last year, there was a bill that said there was a duty of clergy to report child abuse or neglect. And I'm sure most of us have read about the abuse that has, sexual abuse that has gone on in the various churches without having to be reported. The bill in the House, well, both bills, the bill when it was introduced had an exception that clergy had to report unless they got the knowledge through confession. and that was the exception to the rule. The House took that exception away in an amendment. The Senate did not. It passed on the floors and switched houses. When the House got the Senate bill, they added that amendment and sent it back. The Senate refused to do that. And so it stalled, didn't get passed. So that's one that will probably be reintroduced, and will have that same push and pull in terms of do we protect children, or do we protect the religious sanctity of confession? So that's kind of where that is. And we came down on that the amendment was important to have, so that they didn't have that out to not have to report. The second one piece is that in 2020, there was a law passed called the Safe Harbor Law. And that was to establish centers for commercially sexually exploited children. There was to be a center on the east side and the west side. And it also made it so that children caught up in the sex trade were not criminalized. They were seen as victims, and they weren't taken in through the criminal justice system. And that has been successful. However, the actual centers haven't really gotten going. The restrictions were that the building itself could not be a new construction. It had to be already existing. It had to be a licensed mental health, behavioral health, and licensed for residential care. No provider on the west side felt like they met those criteria. And so there was never a center on the west side. On the east side, in Spokane, Daybreak took on that and opened up that center. But they just recently closed because their staff was found to be abusing children. So that is not in the works right now. The folks who have put that bill forward, especially Tina Orwell, is meeting with a different advisory group and trying to figure out how to bring that forward in a way that will actually get it moving, and some tweaks that they might have to the restrictions of how that gets formed. So that'll be an important one to watch. And they may include some respite centers and some daycare centers, some kind of fill gap pieces to it. The other piece that maybe is being considered is that right now it is not mandated that children that go missing in foster care be evaluated for any kind of sexual abuse that they may have experienced while out of care or not there. And so there may be a law that will mandate that kind of reporting gets done, and some training. Many times the adults who come into contact with these children, the social workers, teachers, etc., don't recognize the signs of abuse. Or sometimes, just read a story about a teacher who said that she had come into contact with a young girl that several years later she realized was being sexually abused. But the contact when she first saw her was she was in 5th grade, and she just assumed that that was too young, not recognizing that trafficking happens at all across the board. So I think that's what I have to say. And I'm glad to take any questions.
And Janet, there is a question in the chat, and it asks if we will be actively supporting the child marriage bill. It did not make it through Senate committee because they ran out of time. It made it through the House with a significant majority.
I will watch that bill and see how it comes back. And yes, I assume that we will probably support that.
Other questions for Janet?
Well, what is the marriage bill? What does it say? They can't marry below some age or something?
I'm probably not as familiar with it as the person who asked the question, so I might let her answer that.
So
yeah,
that was
my name's
Carol.
Carol McMahon, 32nd Legislative District, and it is a bill that would prevent forced marriage for basically for minors. I don't have the language with me right here, but there will be testimony from women who were as young as 10 and 12 when they were essentially married to pay off family debt or other types of things. And it's been very widely considered and discussed throughout the US. In fact, the DNC, the Democratic National Convention Committee, is also considering moving that forward. I realize we're not a party affiliated group. I just know that that has reached and is involved in a national level. But there are a number of children that are married just because they're pregnant, and sometimes for other more nefarious reasons.
So Blair is here somewhere, put in the chat, those seeking a marriage license in Washington need to sign affidavits to prove they are at least 18 years old, but 17-year-olds can also obtain a license with written parental consent, and anyone younger can do so if a superior court judge waives the age requirement. So that's a big loophole. And Carol, you had another question about, it was a curiosity about focusing on symptoms of problems, and you talked about having a drive for signing the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a baseline. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of the things that are called out and identified in the United Nations Convention of the Child, this is from 1989, addressed a number of the things that we've been battling and dealing with for over 30 years. And I think that that might perhaps, not having those rights might perhaps be the baseline issue, the real problem. And from that, we should be able to advocate more freely and with confidence on these other issues. I'm not suggesting that we not pursue or continue to pursue what we're doing. I'm just suggesting that this may be the route. And once children are recognized as being human, I think that we might be able to deal with a lot of the concerns that people have, and just put it out there as an idea.
Mm-hmm.
I see Alexandra has a question and I want to get to her, but in a quick response to your thing, Carol, I do think that there is definitely a strand of children not being seen as equal or count as much, or that they have those rights. And I think that would be an important step. In our last one, we were talking about addressing symptoms, which I think most of the laws that we have toward child welfare really are about the symptoms as opposed to getting to the heart of things. And that part of that has to do with poverty and our reluctance to actually provide for families so that they can themselves take care of their children. And that also has a component of attitude that we have had over the years toward not serving certain people, that somehow they're not worthy enough.
Right.
I'm alarmed at the increase in change to child labor laws in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just one more step down that path. There are other things that have been happening that are equally alarming, but that is one example I think we can use.
So
Really
Alex,
important points, Carol. Janet, did you want to say something before
oh,
we go?
well, Alexandra has had her hand up for quite a
Yeah.
while.
I think, Janet, you mentioned the Mockingbird Society in the context of foster care. Did I get that right? Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Correct.
What is it?
Well, it's a social service agency. They have worked with foster care for a long time, but what they do that I think sets them apart is that they involve youth, and that youth is the focus of their work. They have established what they call hub foster care hub homes, so that they have a group of homes that are connected together. They provide support back and forth for each other. They involve the kids in care, so that they get to be part of that. And then they actually work and train the youth to go and advocate for themselves in legislative places. So my respect for them is that they really work to involve youth voice.
Thank you, Alexandra. And Janet, Joanna? You're muted. Oh, there.
So I was wondering if there are any bills that would address the issue of poverty, that if children are being looked at to be removed, are there any bills that say if poverty is the underlying cause, that they'll try to address that first? Are there any laws or things in Washington state to help address that?
Last year, they passed a law that said if housing was the barrier to either a child coming back to the home from foster care, or the incentive to have the child removed, that services would be provided to try and connect those families with resources to have housing. And that's a fine bill. However, there was nothing to provide the families with the money to actually get housing.
So I can think of other situations, like parents are going to work and they don't really have money for childcare, and whatever arrangements they have fall apart, and the child is left alone and then found neglected, and many different situations related to poverty and the stress of poverty. And so I'm wondering if there's more in the works or thoughts.
Well, I know Karen will address some of those childcare issues. And my own bias is that many times looking at those issues of poverty and how they play out, that the legislature has been reluctant to do that, that they work more with just the symptoms and kind of nibble around the edges of the system. So yeah. I can't say that there's a lot going on there that I feel really excited about.
Joanna, I'll talk a little bit about it when I talk about early care and education, but I think maybe now we need to turn to Catherine, who's going to talk about what's going on in education.
Okay. Well, one of the issues that I hoped would be brought up again this year would be to take a hard look at what is known as a prototypical school funding model, which is basically defines basic education and then doles out money for the personnel that they think a prototypical school would need. It was passed in 2011. It hasn't been fully upgraded since then. In what was it? Well, I've lost it now, but last year or the year before, they did add some support personnel to that prototypical school in the form of nurses, counselors, social workers, behavioral health workers. But it's not enough. And every school isn't a prototypical school. Some schools in very wealthy districts might not need as much help because they can use their own money to get help for their kids as a school in a high poverty area. But the funding is just sent out to each school district without any thought of equity, which needs to be looked at. And there needs to be more support personnel provided. But the Speaker of the House indicated that that wasn't going to be looked at this year. So we'll have to wait and see. We will support, again, full funding of special education. Right now, local levies are funding the cost that is above what the state provides them to take care of their special ed kids. And it's not the responsibility of local taxpayers. It's the responsibility of the state and the federal government, but I don't give them much reason to be hopeful. And one of the good things that they did last year was to raise the proportion of special ed kids you could have in your district. And it used to be 13.5% of your enrollment could be classified as special ed. If you went over that, tough luck. They did raise that to 15%, but there are still schools that have more than 15% special ed kids. And so then the district has to go begging to the state for some more funding for those kids, which is not an easy process. Anyway, it's an arbitrary percentage. It needs to be done away with. And every education organization that I'm aware of also believes that this should be done now. Okay, so then going back to the foster kids, I have just had my blood pressure raised recently, reading articles in newspapers and other places about foster kids. And I want to remind all of you that our state constitution has only one paramount duty written in it, and that is to amply fund I want to make sure I get it right. Make ample provision for the education of all children residing within its borders. That includes foster kids. That includes foster kids that are incarcerated, that are only receiving a high school, only 14% of them are receiving a high school diploma, which says they aren't getting the educational resources they need, and that it's the paramount duty of the state to provide those. And that doesn't even mention the other resources, healthcare, behavioral health, that they should be receiving. And there's a reason why they're in prison. They didn't get the help when they were young. And that's what we miss out on so many times. If we take care of the problems when they're 5 or 6 years old or start providing those resources, the likelihood of them being taken care of is much greater than if we just ignore it until they reach teenage years. So anyway, we're hopeful that there's going to be a bill introduced that will force the state to provide education and other resources for foster kids. We'll see where that goes. We don't have a bill number yet, but it's just I had no idea of the largeness of this problem until I read these articles and talked with Janet. It's just deplorable. Okay, and then last year, there were 2 bills that we're going to be following this year. One was House Bill 1109, and that would provide the money from the state to school districts to allow teachers and other counselors, whoever needs to be involved in evaluating a child for special ed, that it could be done during the summer. Right now, if you haven't been evaluated by June, forget it. You're not going to be evaluated until September or later. And that means they're missing out on the services that they should be getting. It passed the House. It didn't make it out of Ways and Means in the Senate. So it means that it can start in Ways and Means and move forward if there's a will. The other was a Senate bill, Senate Bill 5102, stating that every board of directors shall provide resources and materials for the operation of a school library information and technology program. So this is an equity issue. Some of the schools do have full library and what is called now a teacher librarian that works with the kids. And this is the first step towards media literacy, because the teacher librarian is many of those younger kids' first teacher and first introduction to these issues. So it passed the Senate, but didn't get out of the House Appropriations Committee. So it can be starting there and moving forward, and hopefully it will. The other couple of issues that I'd like to address is the fact that school enrollment is dropping. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I think there's 3. One is parents said, gosh, I had to be my child's teacher during the COVID online learning. I might as well just keep them home and homeschool them. Another is that they're afraid. They're afraid of sending their kid to school and that kid will be shot at during the day because it's so prevalent. The third is that there are more online schools somehow allowed in this state, and more kids are in those online schools, which the statistics I've seen show that they have lower graduation rates than a in-place school. So that needs to be looked at. I don't think it will be until maybe next session, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. When enrollment drops, funding from the state drops because they're connected. You get funded for the number of students you have. Schools are going through all sorts of upheaval now because they're having to lower their budgets. And so they're talking about consolidating schools, putting 2 schools into one, which makes it larger and less personal. And teachers less able to address every child in their classroom. So I don't know that the legislature will add any more money for funding for that. They have in the past couple of years, but we'll see what's done this year. But it's an ongoing problem. I think that's, well, I made notes from last session on things I forgot to mention, but but I think the other thing is the poverty issue that has been brought up by Janet and others. If we don't take care of that problem, that's the greatest education problem that we have. It's from the communities that are living in poverty. Both parents are having to work full time and they can't help their kids with schoolwork or many other reasons, but poverty has to be addressed, period. And that's the end of my speech.
Thanks for your passion, Catherine. We have a couple of questions. Kim has had her hand up a long time.
Hey, Kim. You're muted.
Haven't seen you for a long time.
Yeah.
I just wanted to put in a word for how parents can get their kids evaluated for special ed or special concerns. My son was 12 and in 8th grade. Before I learned the phrase, what is it? A focus of concern. If you say, I want my child to be a focus of concern, that automatically gets the kid to be evaluated for an individualized education program. And until you know that phrase, you might be locked out of any chance to get your kid in what they call special ed, which for him was to see a special teacher once a month for this individualized program that they could reach him where he was not keeping up. And that helped him a lot.
Okay.
So I just wanted to put in a word for that phrase, focus of concern.
Focus of concern. Okay, got it.
And one other thing about the Mockingbird Society, Janet, I don't know if this is true anymore because I moved away from Seattle, but the newspaper that's called Real Change, that houseless people hand out, and now they charge $2 or $3. They either once a month or every other week, they have an insert inside Real Change written by the Mockingbird Society teenagers about their experience in foster care. So that might inspire you to pay $2 for your next time you see a Real Change guy out there.
To Joanna, thank you, Kim.
So I know I had 2 questions, but at the moment I only remember one at the moment. But so the issue of demographics, I'm chair of the education committee for Seattle King County, and we had this educational district come and visit with us, and we noticed that some districts had not dropped in enrollment or increased, and while others had. So we asked, well, what is special about those districts that have not decreased or have stayed the same? And his response was that the districts where you see enrollment remaining the same or increasing all have new housing developments that appeal to families. Of course, they're not transit friendly, they're not any of those things, but they have new housing developments, and that's where people want to raise their kids, or at least that appears to be the case. So I guess I'm wondering if the number of children in Washington in general has decreased, and it's hard to look at all the number of children in Seattle right at the moment, but I know somebody has that, but I thought that was interesting, that maybe it's not, like maybe people aren't leaving at such high rates, maybe they're moving to different areas. So what do you know about that?
Well, I don't know specifically about that, but I do know that I think some of our smaller school districts are not losing enrollment like maybe at the larger ones. And that's because they're not just the school, they're the community. And they provide their kids with what they need through their community as well as through their schools. And so that may be a reason why they're not losing enrollment. They may not be gaining enrollment, but it seems to me that if you heard Denny Heck talk at the beginning of this meeting, talking about housing, and he said something like, our policemen, our waitresses and waiters that work in Seattle can't afford to live in Seattle. So if you can't afford to live there, you have to move somewhere else, and then you're going to withdraw your kids and send them to wherever that place is you're now living.
So of course that's true, but there are also people who could afford a house in Seattle, or they could afford a house in one of the new developments. And the house in Seattle is maybe 3 stories high and not as much yard. And the one in the burbs is, so it's not just affordability, it's a type of housing that's being provided and what's in the neighborhood around that, if there's open space. There's a lot more, I think, than just affordability.
Yeah, you're right.
So we need to move on. There are several questions in the chat that are about demographics. I'm not sure that we have the wherewithal to answer them right now, but the questions are, what do we know about the percentage of children in Washington State who are being homeschooled? And then, and somebody put in, it was 39,843 students in 2021. But, those are important questions. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about early care and education, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes to come back to questions. But I have loved working with Janet and Catherine and thinking in a holistic way about the child welfare, the education issues, how they're all interconnected, and how poverty plays a big role in what families are experiencing. I've spent most of my life working in early care and education, starting from when I was a family child care provider when my kids were little. And later I went on to be a child welfare worker, dealing with kids in foster care. And that experience taught me that often our interventions in child protective services, child welfare, are kind of too little too late, that families are so broken by the time the state intervenes. It's hard to figure out how to support them, how we can be helpful. I mean, those are important services, but what I came to believe is that we could do more to support families from the get-go. Home visitation for at-risk families to pregnant moms and parents of infants. Childcare that's high quality to support low-income families working. early care and early childhood programs like ECAP, who provide not just an experience for the child, but provide parenting support and link them to resources. And other intervention services like what happens through schools for kids, young kids who have special needs. And a quote that has always stuck with me is one that, you know, we can put ambulances at the bottom of the cliff to get people after they've fallen off the cliff, or we can put fences at the top of the cliff to keep families and children from falling off. And so I think we could do a lot more in building fences. There'll always be some that fall over the cliff, but how much better if we can get to families before they're in trouble. And so one of the things that happened with COVID-19 is it really highlighted the holes in our childcare system. And as in terms of access to childcare, a lot of childcare providers went out of business. They couldn't, how do they deal with being closed down for months and then, you know, bringing staff back? So in 2021, the legislature passed the Fair Start for Kids Act, which is comprehensive legislation to expand accessible, affordable childcare and early childhood development programs. And so much of what has happened in the last couple years in the legislature has had to do with implementing that act. So last year, increasing reimbursement rates for pre-K programs, childcare providers serving kids through the state subsidy program, and home visitation contractors, and also funding to help providers and ECAP programs serve families and children with complex needs. And several bills that passed last year were one that I think is really important, is that for caregivers and parents who lose a job because they don't have care for their child or the senior they're caring for, eligibility for unemployment benefits to give them a bridge. There are provisions around child care assistant for enrollees in apprenticeship programs, and one to broaden access to child care help for immigrant families. This year, the expectations are fairly modest, as we've heard, because it's a supplemental budget session, but there are proposals around increasing investments in early childhood mental health consultation. There's one on excluding child support, Social Security, and SSI payments from family income in determining eligibility for child care subsidies and pre-K programs. And then also increasing pre-K slots toward a target of entitlement for pre-K for eligible families by 2026. Looking toward 2025, there's a really interesting proposal on the horizon that is being generated by a group of providers and is supported by some of the advocacy groups and the state agency around moving from reimbursing childcare providers based on what parents can afford and moving to paying for childcare based on a full cost of care, which would assume providers getting paid a living wage. And that's probably not going to go very far this session. We'll probably see reports, we'll see discussion, maybe study session, but there's a push to begin implementing that model in 2025 or getting legislation to support that model. So I think that's one of the more interesting things on the horizon. Anyway, we have a few more minutes. So I see Alexandra, you have your hand up. You're muted though.
Thank you. Thank you. So talking about early child care providers, people who provide parenting education, I mean, a lot of these businesses are run mostly by women who have backgrounds in providing care. And I'm thinking about, you know, all the advocacy groups that support small businesses, like a local chamber of commerce. But I'm like wondering if there is any advocacy groups or groups of providers that really band together to support these entrepreneurial women who are trying to run childcare centers. I mean, it's a difficult, daunting process to get licensed by the state. I'm just wondering if it seems like there's some funding, but how do we get that funding in the hands of providers so they can provide the care that's needed yesterday?
This is an excellent point. And I think it's why I'm so excited about this diverse group of providers that is meeting and are supported by the advocacy groups to come up with a plan about what they think they need. And I think that's really something to watch. There is a strong advocacy community around childcare and early learning. In fact, I went to a retreat a couple of weeks ago of the Early Learning Action Alliance, and it operates under the auspices of the Children's Alliance. And the League of Women Voters of Washington, we are part of that coalition, as is, you know, the Head Start ECAP Association, the provider groups, the Resource and Referral Network. And they have a lot of access and power in the legislature. The other group that's part of that is SEIU, which is the union that represents home-based childcare providers. And again, they are an active voice in advocating for providers. But if Alexandra, if you Google Early Learning Action Alliance, you'll see the list of people and organizations that are part of that group and what their 2023 legislative agenda was. And I think within a week or so, they'll have the 2024 legislative agenda up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna.
Yes, so you talked about this a little bit. Is there any thought of trying to develop a system that would be sort of a universal access to daycare and to preschool? Because it seems, you know, one, I think that many times a lot of people have to apply for some of these special things and say I'm in poverty, and I know of no group that's more scrutinized than people in poverty or children in foster care. I mean, they are very scrutinized all of their lives. And sometimes it feels like if there's just sort of a more universal way of addressing these things and welcoming people in, we could solve a lot of problems, plus they would be embraced by everyone.
Right. I mean, you know, it's true. And I think that Catherine and I in our lifetime have both worked on issues around making child care and early learning maybe part of the education system. But it's a complex system in that, you know, you've got these childcare providers who are small businesses.
Right.
And we as a society don't have a history of taking what's done by the private sector and making it a public, offering. And yet I think one of the things we all struggle with is there's no consistent funding source. And that contributes to the fragmentation. I mean, there's some federal grant money that comes into the state. We got a lot of money through COVID for early learning and childcare, but that money now is going away. So, you know, I think, I don't know, Catherine, do you want to weigh in?
No, but the League of Women Voters of Washington does have a position to move early learning into basic education. But it's never gone anywhere because it's so terribly expensive to just fund K through 12. And then to add another layer to it, it would cost more money. And even though it's their paramount duty, the legislators don't want to put more money into education.
Well, and I think that when people have kids in daycare, they do want a little bit more personal choice, and some of them want more hours, some of them want fewer hours, and sometimes some people work night shifts. So yeah, it might not. I like structuring it like the school system might not work out so well, and finding a way to work with the small businesses that are dedicated to providing it, because I know a lot of people here are very dedicated to providing good care. So,
and also somehow, I know the state probably cannot force them, but getting big corporations, companies to provide on the spot childcare for their workers would help them retain their workers and help their workers have their child close by during the day.
and that works out well, although if you change jobs, you lose your child care. So,
Well,
And
yeah,
if you have,
but if you don't have a job, you lose your child
Right.
care anyway. So.
right,
Well,
either, I mean,
and I think that there's been some research that suggests that families, particularly in the evening, really want their kids at home or in a home setting as opposed to in an, you know, at work, or I don't know. I told Catherine and Janet when we were talking that I've worked on this issue for probably 40 years. And in 85, we thought, oh, we got to get the businesses to do childcare, and you get a few, but it's a costly proposition. So,
well,
it-
there are a few businesses that do that. I think in SAS, this one group does do it. I'm trying to remember how it works. And I think the people who use it really like it, but it's, and I'm not sure why some companies can't make it a benefit, but I guess then they take on the issue of making sure it's good and the liabilities and.
Yep. So other questions? I should check the chat and see if we've got questions in the chat. Oh, somebody asked, what is ECAP? Sorry about that. ECAP is the Early Childhood Education and Assistance Program, and it's the Washington State Pre-K program for 3 and 4-year-olds. And, you know, we have slots for Head Start that cover a portion of the children who are eligible, and ECAP, we're committed to, between Head Start and ECAP, serving all income eligible 3 and 4-year-olds. So that's the state's goal. Let's see. Gilda said, I'm in the North Shore School District, where we are at the top of our levy bond percentages, so we can't ask the community for more funds. Gilda, do you want to talk about this?
Oh, no, it was more because we had to do a discussion on, schools and the whole budget problem. Every school is different. And so our problem is a little unique in that, we are somewhat better off than a lot of other communities, but we're still having the problem. And we can't just go and ask for more money because there's limits on how much we can ask due to the McCleary decision. So we're kind of stuck and we have to cut the services that we are doing right now in order to make up for the budget. Cut. I know my understanding from talking to schools that one source is they were expecting to get more special education funding last year and it didn't happen. And that's kind of a big chunk of with it. It's just that our special education costs a lot more. And I know this is a problem every school has, that, it costs more than what we're getting to do it. And then on top of it, because the way the federal government allocated the COVID funds, it said, well, you guys aren't that poor, so you don't get that much. Even though we still had a lot of expenses that were like fixing the HVAC and things like that, which don't really, doesn't cost you more or less. But we can't make up that lack by putting another levy.
And what you mentioned, the sort of cap on levies by McCleary, what they said was levies have to be for extras. They can't be to cover basic education. However, for all those school districts that are using their levies to cover special education,
we're doing that too.
The state troopers aren't marching in and arresting them for disobeying the law. It's a dilemma.
So let me just read something from the chat and then I'll go to Joanna, and we're going to get the message pretty soon that we have to move, I'm afraid. But there was Carol put in chat that childcare when parents who work nights are trying to sleep in the daytime would look different. And that was an issue we talked a little bit about during our last segment. And there is a proposal from the state agency to create a $500 addition on top of the regular childcare rates for families who need non-standard hour care. And that would help be an incentive to providers to do non-standard hour care and help them have longer days or hire employees. And so there are efforts, but it is an ongoing challenge. Joanna, I'm going to turn to you.
Okay. Yeah, I guess for me, I feel like I make every attempt to understand, but in Seattle, for instance, we have the county Best Starts for Kids. We have their early learning and education levy, and they all supposedly contribute something to somebody for childcare or early learning. And then you have the state, and I have a very difficult time figuring out how they all fit together.
Well, join the crowd.
Yeah, you're in good company, Joanna. In fact, there was a bill that Catherine and I followed last year that would require coordination among schools and childcare and early learning programs at the local level, because in some communities they are kind of stumbling over each other. So.
Okay, thank you. I hope you help me.
And the last thing in the chat is levies also cover capital budget for construction, don't they?
That's a separate levy. You can run a capital levy and operations and maintenance levy. Those both take 50% voter approval.